Hi, welcome. Welcome to you in the room and welcome to everyone who's joining us by Zoom. I'm Robin Lipsky and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Historical Society for the Ninth Circuit, the NJCHS. Just a very quick infomercial about us. We have a mission of protecting and educating about the vibrant legal history of the West and more generally about the importance of an independent judiciary. We're so glad you're all here with us today. You can find out more about our organization, and we really hope you will, off of our website, njchs.org. Please sign up for our newsletter so that you can find out about more of our programming and also maybe even become a member. I want to take a moment first to thank our hosts, the District of Arizona. We're so happy to be here, and we so appreciate their support and also the support of their amazing IT staff. And to the FBA chapter for Phoenix, we're so thrilled for your support as well and happy to partner with you on this program. This year, both our journal and our programming is dedicated to water in the West. This is our second program in the series. And what I've learned from our water law experts as we plan these programs is that we are all bound and connected by water and all by our need for water, and that binds us all to each other. And that while there are many challenges to protecting and sharing this resource, there are also some positive examples of cooperation. In our recent program in Hawaii, we learned that the community has come together to restore watersheds and that the feds and the state are working together to stave off the economic and ecological threat of stony coral tissue loss disease. I can't wait to hear what today's panel will tell us about the Colorado River Basin. And so without further ado, I will turn the panel over to our moderator, Professor Rhett Larson. Professor Larson is Professor of Water Law at ASU and a Senior Research Fellow at the Kyle Center for Water Policy. He also is the guest editor of our next issue of our journal coming out shortly, all about water in the West, and we are so grateful for all of his time and effort and everything that he has done dedicated to helping us educate all of us on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thanks to everyone who's been so kind enough to be able to organize this program, and to all of our attendees. As is often the case with water, and particularly water in Arizona, I see a lot of familiar faces, including some of my former students and soon-to-be former students who are just about to graduate. So those are always great faces to see. And I am deeply grateful to our panelists who are not only eminent water leaders and thinkers, but also happen to be, all four of them, very dear friends and colleagues of mine. So I will briefly introduce them to you, but I don't want to take too much time. Better for you to hear from them than to hear about them. But to my far right is Professor Derrick Beetso. He is the director of the Indian Gaming and Self-Governance Program at Arizona State University, the former general counsel for the National Congress of American Indians. To my immediate right is Richard Morrison. Richard is an adjunct professor teaching agricultural law at Arizona State University and the co-founder of the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University. To my immediate left is Catherine Sorensen. Catherine is the director of research at the Kyle Center for Water Policy and is also the former director of Phoenix's water system and the city of Mesa's water system, and a doctor of economics as well. And to my far left is Sarah Porter. Sarah is the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy, which is just one of the preeminent nonpartisan water think tanks in the West, and also the former head of the Audubon Society here in Phoenix as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I thought I would start with a general question that I hope each one of you will take a minute to answer. We're going to be talking about the intersection of water equity and the Colorado River, which they intersect in all kinds of interesting ways. But I do want to get one fundamental question out of the way, which is when you hear water equity, and particularly in the context of the Colorado River Basin, what do you think we're talking about? So maybe we'll start with Sarah on the far left.
Thanks so much for starting with me, Rhett. Well, let me answer what people I know are asking about, and then let me answer with what we should be thinking about. And so, or what I think we should be thinking about. And so people ask me all the time about water equity, and their concern is typically that they are municipal water users who are very worried that low-income people in their own community won't be able to afford water if we have more shortages. or other challenges. I think what we should be thinking about is tribal water rights in the state of Arizona, where we have yet to resolve so many tribal water, the claims of a large number of tribes.
Catherine?
You know, and I agree with Sarah, but I see those things as intertwined. So yeah, I think when people think of equity, oftentimes they think about drinking water equity, because that is our most pressing need. It supports public health and the health of our communities and economic development. But there is a huge intersection there, even with the tribes, because while some tribes have been able to effectuate water settlements and make full use of their water right claims, others have not. But even for those who have, it is often the case that they lack and cannot afford the infrastructure that allows for the delivery of safe, clean water across their lands. So there's a huge intersection there. But to me, coming from the municipal side, I always think of drinking water. Because if we fail to provide safe, clean drinking water to our communities, and particularly to those who are most vulnerable, then we as a society, we fundamentally fail at some point.
Richard?
When I heard that question, my mind went to the philosophical conundrum that is often discussed among philosophers and academics who are philosophy professors. It's hard to analyze even what you mean by equity without thinking about whether the concept of fairness should apply to intention or to results. And the problem with being a consequentialist is that we cannot always accurately foresee the consequences of our choices. So it's, I'm speaking a little bit in the abstract, obviously, about this concept of equity, but I don't think you get very far in a discussion like this without trying to put some definition to the term. And maybe Derrick can take it from here.
Just define equity, Derrick. You'll be fine.
I appreciate my panelists' comments, and I agree with those. I think when we talk about equity, we have to understand that we're not talking about equality. When you talk about equity, you're talking about meeting people where they're at in a lot of circumstances. And one of my colleagues mentioned tribal nations as water rights, and that's definitely one community that has certain needs that are unique to other communities in Arizona. And we also mentioned low-income housing residents that have unique needs as well. So when we think about equity, I think we have to take ourselves out of this space where we're thinking about meaning everybody gets an equal share. I think we have to think about what are the different legal instruments at play, what is the different historical circumstances of different communities, what are the different processes that might put one community at a disadvantage from other communities under different systems to allocate water. I think all those things come into play when we think about water equity. So I guess that's my shot at trying to define what equity is. So.
Well, Derrick, I'll stay with you. So this has to be one of the most critical moments in the water history of the Navajo Nation, with both the Supreme Court we're waiting on hearing a decision back about Navajo Nation v. Department of the Interior, and we are literally in the midst of the trial for the quantification of the Navajo Nation's water rights in the Little Colorado River General Stream adjudication. So in this sort of historic moment for the Navajo Nation, what do you see as the role of law and equity in sort of moving water access forward for the Dene?
That's a difficult question. So I am Dene. My name is Derrick Beetso, Derrick Beetso Yeneshe. I'm from Tuba City, Arizona. That's my hometown. But I'm actually from the desert outside of Tuba City, Arizona, so about 30 miles east of Tuba City. My grandpa dug Beetso well. You guys can Google it and look at it online. So we are groundwater users traditionally, in our homeland. And so this is near and dear to my heart. As an example, growing up, probably went with my uncles to get barrels of water, probably twice a week. We were told not to waste water, and that includes, not drinking too much of it. So if you think about these communities, that are still living like that to this day, you can understand what the gravity of this moment is the way that Rhett's talked about it. But at the same time, this has been going on for a long time, right? I mean, the treaties, that are at play in the Navajo Nation Supreme Court case were signed in the late 1800s, right? And, federal reserve water rights when it comes to tribes are very complicated. They're reserved at the time that the reservation was set aside for the tribe. But in order to actually get wet water, you actually need a lot of federal action and federal activity to actually quantify that water right. And so the nation has been waiting, with a priority date of, as early as 1839, as late as 1868, to have these water needs met. And they have the earlier priority date, but they don't have the actual firmed up water right. So for us, it's a critical moment for sure. We talked about, what does water equity mean? And I offered up that maybe you have to assess some sort of need. And I think that's what's at play in the Supreme Court case, is whether or not the Department of Interior, as a trustee to Indian tribes, has a duty to at least assess the water needs of tribes as related to the water sources around the reservation, which may include the Colorado River, but could also include the lower Colorado River or groundwater resources or what have you. So there's a lot going on right now. And I think the tribe itself is very cognizant of it because they live in this day-to-day situation of hauling water to their neighbors and to their communities. And then, so it's a difficult question that you asked, but at the same time, it's an important one that we should discuss more. But I want to pause there, see if there's any other thoughts.
Well, I participated in the negotiation of 4 completed Indian water rights settlements: Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, Fort McDowell, San Carlos Apache, and Gila River Indian community water rights settlements. And it became obvious to me a long time ago, 40 years ago, that the real incentive for these tribes to compromise their water rights claims was to get funding out of the settlement, principally from the federal government, some from the state of Arizona. But, you can have the earliest priority on the river, and it doesn't do you very much good if you don't have any way to get the water out of the river and distributed through a system to the place of its intended use. Well, those distribution systems are very, very expensive, and so, the settlements came replete with funding. I don't know if that is a viable solution for the needs of all of our tribes in Arizona, but it certainly went a long way toward meeting the needs of some of the tribes.
Well, Catherine, that takes me to one of your favorite subjects, which is the relationship between infrastructure and equity and infrastructure financing as well. And as someone who's managed and overseen huge municipal water systems, you're uniquely well situated to talk about financing and infrastructure they relate to equity.
Yeah, no, Richard is correct. It's even if you can quantify a water right, and be that for a tribe or any community in Arizona, that quantifying the right and understanding what water you have is just one part of the problem. The other is actually making use of that water through a distribution system or canal or pump system, depending on where your community is and what their needs are. And sure, I have a lot of experience delivering water through these systems in large cities. But one of the added complications for tribal lands in Arizona and for rural communities is that there's a smaller number of people over which you can spread the monumental cost of these distribution systems. And so that is an additional challenge to achieving water equity. At the same time, it is important that local communities help pay for these systems because throughout the world, reliance on a third party to pay for these very expensive systems has, for the most part, not turned out particularly well. Richard made a comment earlier about intention versus consequence. And look, when it comes to the provision of safe, clean water, everyone has the right intention. I think that you would be challenged to find a human on this planet that doesn't want desperately for everyone else on the planet to have access to safe, clean water. But when you rely on third parties to fund those systems, if you look across the world, what you see are systems that tend not to be adequately funded because no one cares more about the condition of a water distribution system than the people who actually depend on it. And so there is this very complicated tie between the physical need to provide the infrastructure and the financing for it, and the fact that in many communities, even if they want to pay for it, there simply aren't enough people in small rural communities to be able to afford that cost. So it's complicated.
And I could add one more reason why it's important for some communities, not all, to be on the hook for paying for their water infrastructure, and that is that we don't have enough water in Arizona and enough money in Arizona to deliver water wherever and how much ever anyone wants it. And so that, I would call it a market element of needing to have a ratepayer base. In the case of some communities, and I would make an exception. For example, tribal communities are in a different situation because there's a treaty relationship, there's a tribal homeland, and there are obligations on the part of the United States to related to that. But we really do need to make augmentation and infrastructure investments where there will be a ratepayer base to pay them back. Otherwise, we'll have boondoggles all over the place.
Well, Sarah, I'm going to stick with you for one question, which is, I worry when we talk about equity that our default position, and it's understandable, is to be anthropocentric, that equity means human beings. So what's the role of equity in thinking about riparian ecosystems, marine ecosystems, and the protection of the environment?
I think it still is, I mean, from a practical perspective, it's going to be anthropocentric because we really do need people to create the legal architecture to make sure that there's water in water-dependent natural areas. And so it'll come down to humans' assessment of what's worth protecting and what's worth saving. Of course, we've probably all encountered different places where the environment is given status as having rights. Maybe waterways are given a kind of right status. Those all just beg the question. They really do. The question is, what do you want to protect? How are you going to protect it? And then we'll get down to brass tacks and fight over that. So I'm not sure equity is so broadly defined these days. For me, it's not a very helpful framework.
Well, maybe this is something that we can talk about as a group for a minute, which is or should equity be the aim of water policy and water law? Or are we better off talking about sustainability or adaptability or resiliency? What should be our main focus as water policymakers, as water lawyers, as water leaders?
Well, I might start off by sharing a conversation I had with Dan Tarlock, Professor Dan Tarlock, emeritus retired professor from Chicago, Kent, who, for any water people, you would know he has written what is generally conceded to be the preeminent water law and policy treatise in the United States. And I asked him this very question about the utility of equity, and particularly in settling water controversies. And he said, I don't think it's a very useful concept. He said, because the basic problem is everybody thinks they have equitable claims. Mm-hmm. Now, where do we go from there?
Well, so here's another question, which maybe is worthwhile. So shortage, which we are in shortage in the Colorado River Basin, we're in tier 2 shortage. Right now, people may be thinking, but didn't we have a really wet winter? And we did, and that's fantastic. We're still waiting to see what the runoff numbers are going to look like, about how much that water is going to hit the river. But when people say, oh, well, we had a wet winter, my caution to people is, imagine you lost your job, you're losing your health insurance, you're getting evicted from your apartment, and you put on your jacket and you find a $100 bill in your jacket. You have every reason to be happy. A $100 bill is fantastic. It didn't really solve your long-term problem, though. And that's a little bit like having one wet winter in all these decades. We still have real problems to solve that one wet winter isn't going to resolve. Now, shortage creates real challenges, but shortage may create opportunities. Each one of our panelists has, I think, a unique perspective on where the challenges are coming from and what the opportunities are. So, Derrick, I'll start with you. The challenges of shortage in the Colorado River Basin and the opportunities for tribes?
Yeah, I think the challenges are pretty obvious. I think I've seen a number of these panels recently because everybody realizes we're in a bad situation, particularly in the lower basin. I think the challenges are, as Robin noted at the outset, that you have a lot of tribes that haven't quantified their water rights. And from the tribal perspective, you're talking about the permanent homeland. You're talking about, making sure that the permanent homeland is sustainable for present and future generations, and that means a lot. That means not only drinking water, it also means agricultural water, municipal water. It also means water for cultural purposes as well. And you could go on. But what that means outside of the tribal communities is that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? Because the tribes have this priority date that precedes a lot of water users on the stem. And so I think it's in everybody's best interest to try to address those, which creates opportunity, right? Because as you start to think about, what does water look to in the future, but you have all these unresolved claims that have, really old priority dates, then a lot of municipalities have uncertainty about how much water they actually have, right? So I think there's a huge opportunity there. And it's a shame that it comes, on the heels of this kind of danger point on the river. But at the same time, I think tribes are realizing that they really have to go all in and try to figure out, what their water situation is, so that they can preserve their homeland for their people.
Now, Richard, your family's been farming for a long time in the valley. You've represented farmers. What do you see as shortage, the challenges and opportunities for farmers in shortage?
Well, the immediate challenge, of course, is the fact of the shortage itself. Most of you probably know that Pinal County agriculture is down to zero water from CAP this year, except for what might be delivered by municipalities as a part of an underground storage project. And I don't know, Catherine has the numbers, but I think maybe that was estimated to be a mere 20 to 40,000 acre feet for 2023, but whatever it is, it's not nearly enough water to keep all of Pinal County growing crops. But, just like all politics is local, well, water challenges are local too. Not everybody has the same water rights. Yuma, for example, the growers in Yuma, some of them have the #1 priority on the Colorado River. Some of them have the 3rd priority on the Colorado River. Those with a 3rd are really concerned about being cut back because of the low reservoirs in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Those with priority 1 are also feeling a little threatened. So they're looking at what they can do in the way of conservation. Now, this is the opportunity for agriculture. Agriculture has done a great deal to save water since the passage of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And more recently, agriculturalists have continued to implement new technology, drip systems, sprinkler systems, and so forth to save even more. The old flood method of just flooding the furrows from the high end of the field to the low end was relatively inefficient. I've talked to several vegetable growers in Yuma who believe that they have reduced their water consumption by 22% just by putting in sprinkler systems. However, this is one of the reasons why you have to think about their local conditions. For example, some of these same Yuma growers are having to put on more water than they want to because they have salty soils, and they have to leach that salt out of the root zone or their crops will suffer, if not die. So they're putting on more water than is really needed for the consumptive use of the crop just to keep the soil conditions appropriate for growing. Now, I could go on, but 6 months ago, I worried that there might not be enough financing to help pay for all the new conservation technology that people are urging farmers to adopt and implement. The technology is there, but it's really extremely expensive in some cases, depending upon what you're trying to do. But within the last 6 months, there was $19.5 billion allocated out of the Inflation Reduction Act over the next 5 years for natural resources conservation and stewardship programs. An additional $4 billion was secured under that same act to combat drought in the Colorado River Basin. The USDA Secretary Vilsack announced initiatives under USDA's jurisdiction to pay for smart crop, water smart initiatives. And the state of Arizona has also created a fund to help pay for conservation. This is an opportunity. I mean, I believe that we will not always face the same struggle we face in the present over the drought condition. But we have to get from where we are to where we want to be in terms of having reliable and sustainable supplies, and conservation will help take us there. The one caveat I would say is all the farmers I know say, don't press reduction in acreage upon us. Don't tell us we have to set aside our acreage. You can talk to us about conservation all day long, but don't tell us about setting aside our acreage. And here's why. They have fixed costs. And if they're going to cut their acreage by 25% or 50% or 75%, they can't cover their costs unless they get a great deal more for their crops. And that is not likely to happen because the American consumer is absolutely addicted to cheap food. Furthermore, not only do they want cheap food, they basically expect it. And that's a huge political reality that confronts pricing and marketing of agricultural commodities.
So, Catherine, challenges and opportunities for cities in shortage.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Let me take just a quick step back and put it in the context of equity. It's important for people to understand that the cities in central Arizona do not have equitable access to water supplies between themselves. So there are cities that are relatively water rich, and there are cities that are relatively water poor. And of course, our system of water rights here in Arizona, as mentioned, operates on, as in first in time, first in right. So if you think about the rights that were here in the Valley of the Sun, of course, first, the Native American communities, they hold the highest rights. For the most part, the Native American communities in this area have settled their water rights claims. But that would be the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, the Gila River Indian community, the Fort McDowell, San Carlos. I feel like I'm missing some. Thank you, Tohono O'odham. They have very high priority rights. And through these settlements, they have been willing to lease some of that water back to different cities for municipal use. And one of the positive things about the settlements that have taken place here in central Arizona is that they've created these really great partnerships and innovative ways to move water around between municipal uses that maybe don't have the same access to Colorado River water that other municipalities do. So, but here in central Arizona, we also have access to the Salt and Verde River system through the Salt River Valley Water Users Association. And the areas within that association that grew up first, so if you think about the middle of the Valley of the Sun, that's Phoenix, Tempe, West Mesa, tend to be relatively, water-rich cities because they have access to those supplies. But as you go further and further out from the middle of the Valley of the Sun, cities tend to have less access to Salt and Verde River supplies and less access to Colorado River water. That's why the partnership with the tribes has been so important for us here in central Arizona. It's really enabled many cities to gain access to water supplies that they otherwise would not have, which is crucially important. But yeah, so that was a very roundabout way of saying that the impact of Colorado River shortage will fall very unequally throughout central Arizona. How it falls depends not only on the water supplies that each city enjoys, but also on how they're using that water. There's a different impact to Colorado River shortage if the water is being used as tap water than if it is being used for aquifer recharge. And we see different strategies among the different cities and tribes here in central Arizona. So there will be very disparate impacts. But one of the things that gives me hope is that, through the difficult conversations of the water rights settlements, we got to know each other. And I really feel optimistic because I feel like we learned to be innovators, we learned to be collaborative, we learned how to move water around and come up with solutions that we otherwise wouldn't have.
Now, Sarah, you have served in advisory capacities to the governor and to both senators. So you've had a sort of front row seat to the challenges of water policy with elected officials and in government. So what do you see as the challenges and opportunity for both state and federal government?
Well,
That's a big one.
I could go on all day. Of course, the biggest challenge in the Colorado River is that since 1922, management of the river has operated by consensus of the 7 states that share it, and we like to think and Mexico, and increasingly and when we say consensus by the states, we mean the water users in the state. We don't mean the governors of 7 states. And it is very hard to herd all those wildcats in one direction, especially when what we're asking them to do is give up water. So fundamentally, that's really difficult, especially in the context of outstanding claims by tribes that have yet to be resolved, and in the context of a question about the extent of the Secretary of Interior's authority to take the action which is threatened as, the ultimatum. If you don't come up with an agreement on your own, then, the Secretary will act, except we'll have years and years of litigation. So that's the challenge. But I do think there are big opportunities here, and I would say that the biggest challenge is trying to organize the efforts in order to take advantage of them. We really need to be moving toward a hotter, drier Intermountain West, a hotter, drier Colorado River Basin. And the estimates are currently we expect 15 million acre feet of water among the 7 states. We have allocated that much out. And there are estimates that maybe the more reasonable figure would be 9 million acre feet. It's certainly much less than 15. Maybe it's a little higher than 9. So we have to figure out a way to take less water out of the system. And currently, agriculture is the major user of Colorado River water. There are various estimates, but it's probably safe to say that in the entire basin, agriculture is responsible for about 75% of the consumptive use. And cities are responsible for somewhat, somewhere between 20 and 24% of the consumptive use of water in the Colorado Basin. So to get to where we need to go, we have to get high priority, senior priority agricultural users to a place where they will leave water in the system. And there are lots of different ways to do that. I think it's an exciting moment to think about how we can use market mechanisms. One crazy idea that the Kyle Center's been sort of thinking about is, what if we only allowed agricultural water users who have had their supplies shorted to purchase water from an agricultural water user anywhere in the basin? You could imagine that a mechanism like that would mean that some of the lower value, as we might say, agriculture would be happy to stop growing hay, let's say, in someplace in Wyoming, in favor of simply leaving the water in the system and getting a check. So there are opportunities like that. Another big opportunity is that we can leverage dollars and threats, I guess, to push efficiency, particularly agricultural efficiency, but municipal efficiency as well, across the board. And we see it happening. Right now, there's a lot of push for a reduction in residential turf in the greater Phoenix area, even though much of that turf is watered with SRP water, not Colorado River water, and it won't make a difference in terms of the Colorado River, but the optics are very important. Likewise, I was at an event yesterday where the Deputy Director of the Department of Water Resources talked about how the Bureau of Reclamation is taking a look at how it defines beneficial use, and that would be particularly in the context of agriculture. There are wild ideas about how to define beneficial use all the way, I would say this is very wild, all the way out to what types of crops could be grown, but there are more conservative ways of defining beneficial use, which would revolve around standards of efficiency, probably something like what we have in Arizona in our active management plans, where we have water duties for different crops, and we expect certain levels of efficiency. So there's really an opportunity with the Colorado, with this difficult time, this difficult task that we have in the Colorado Basin, to actually transform the basin across the board. The real challenge is pulling together the different efforts, the different strands, the different influencers to work together to create that transformation.
So the pulling together leads me to another question that I wonder if everybody here might have a thought about, which is, one thing I always caution people when we talk about water politics in the Colorado River Basin is when people say the tribes think this or the tribes want that. The tribes in Arizona are very diverse, and they're very diverse geographically, and Gila River Indian community is in a very different water situation than Walupai. And when people say, well, the tribes are being excluded or left aside, I always caution people that, you know, Gila River Indian community, for example, I think has been one of the great leaders and innovators in water policy in Arizona. But that doesn't mean that we aren't still facing problems. I think it's telling that the SEIS is not particularly focused on tribal water rights. I think it's telling that the 6-state proposal and California's proposal, none of these included tribal signatories. So while there's progress, we're not nearly far enough along in terms of bringing everyone to the table and giving everyone a voice. What are the obstacles to more tribal voices at the table, and what can we do to overcome those obstacles?
When I talk to people about the current water crisis and what it might take to navigate through this period of time, a lot of people, surprisingly to me, a lot of people seem to think, well, you just get everybody in the room at the same time and you just work it out. I don't think so. I worked on the Gila River Water Rights Settlement for 17 years. It was on again, off again, took a long time, people backed away, reconsidered their positions, more parties joined, some parties opted out at the end. Pretty dynamic situation. It just took a long time to pull it off. And, you know, there were times when we had probably 100 lawyers at the tables. Sometimes only 50 would show up. But given the complexity of that single water rights settlement agreement, taking so long and involving so many people, with the result proving to be almost elusive for a long period of time. And, you know, I have stories. But in any event, I mean, you might wonder what broke the logjam. Well, Senator Kyle's leadership, from my point of view, was the deciding factor in making it possible to come to a conclusion. But I don't see the practicality of getting all the stakeholders in the room. Furthermore, you know, I think a lot about organizational behaviors. And every organization has its mission, has its reason for being. It has its stakeholders, the people it serves. I don't think anybody in the present climate is going to want to stand accused of betraying their own stakeholders by compromising their claims or undercutting their organizational mission. And I think in times of extreme shortage, what we're going to see is that all of this cooperation Catherine talked about, all this goodwill that we worked so hard to develop on a collaborative basis may begin to erode. I think we're a lot more siloed in the water world than we have ever had to admit before, and I think that will become obvious as we move over or through the next few years.
Could I just say that one thing that is very different about where we are in Colorado River negotiations than we have been in the past is there is a lot of money, and there hasn't been a lot of money before. So that may help as a little bit of an antidote to the erosion of trust. And I appreciate, Richard, what you just said, because Senator Kyle has talked about and even lectured about a continuum that he has kind of observed in water negotiations through the course of his career, where on one side you have transparency and inclusivity, and on the other side you have the opposite, maybe secrecy, lack of transparency, not so much inclusivity. And his point is, the more you move toward transparency and inclusivity, the harder it is to make a deal. And you have to find the place on this continuum. And what is moving here is the degree of trust among the people involved in the negotiations. So you have to find the sort of happy spot on the continuum where you have sufficient trust, and it's hard to build that trust in a place where everything everyone says is completely transparent and known.
Yeah, I would agree with my colleagues here. To Richard's point, I totally agree about the digging in at the heels of the various parties protecting their stakeholders' interests. I think that's a huge issue here in Arizona. I think you have a lot of folks that feel very threatened by the thought of tribes quantifying their water rights that haven't done so already. But it's a practical reality that needs to be done. I think people need to have a little bit more education and understanding about treaty rights and what they mean. About what it means to set aside a permanent homeland and have those duties, go into perpetuity. I think another layer to this situation with respect to at least Indian water rights is the federal component of it, and the need to have the federal government basically be the driving force behind a lot of those settlements. You have a lot of tribes that are waiting in line, to have their water rights, to have a water rights team set up for them. And then you have some water rights teams that have been around for 17 years, 20 years, as Richard was talking about, that still have a lot of work to do. And then even those water rights that are settled still have implementation teams that have their needs as well, because what Congress thought was the solution to the problem in 1980 is no longer relevant, because there are new issues that have came up, and so you need congressional amendments. So there's a lot going on. I think, when you think about the federal component to all this, and then you think about how water rights have been set up to be really a local issue, decided within the states, and I think that, you can see where there are issues and obstacles. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that consensus doesn't mean that everybody likes it, that everybody walks away happy with, what happens. It just means you can live with it, right? And so I'm a little bit more of an optimist, but there are a lot of challenges and a lot of obstacles for sure.
And I just want to give some context here, because I think this idea of obstacles, because I think sometimes people have this idea that it's farmers against cities, or mines against tribes, or the federal government against the state, or whatever. And I've participated in two water rights settlements, the Gila River Indian Community and the White Mountain Apache Tribe. And I can tell you, it's just everybody against everybody, right? Like it's city A against city B, and it's irrigation district X against irrigation district Y, and it's this tribe against that. It's everybody against everybody. So to the point about obstacles, yeah, there are many obstacles, but we need to go at addressing those obstacles with the idea that every water user has their own unique agenda. And putting them in different labels or categories is not necessarily helpful in understanding what those agendas are, or in trying to figure out how to work together. And yeah, absolutely, at the end of the day, there will hopefully be a consensus. And if we've done the settlement, be it a water rights settlement or any kind of conversation on the Colorado River, if we've done it correctly, then everyone hates it, right? Because that's how you know that it actually is a reasonable balance between all of those different water users.
I've worked in water development projects in developing countries around the world, and one thing that struck me is that frequently the greatest challenge that I would run into is not related to water. It's related to a lack of trust in institutions and in the government. And I was attending recently here in Arizona a meeting that was dealing with agriculture and water, and this group was talking about what were the greatest obstacles to water sustainability. And in a room full of water professionals and farmers, they seemed to reach the consensus that the biggest challenge is political polarization and a lack of trust in institutions, that is actually our problem. So I'm just wondering if you all have thoughts about the role of distrust, of polarization, of a perceived lack of legitimacy in institutions, and the role that's playing in impeding improved water management.
Well, stepping away from the Colorado River, in Arizona, areas that are outside of irrigation non-expansion areas and active management areas, many communities are vulnerable to, big new groundwater demand. And we're seeing it pop up because of industrial scale agriculture that realizes we're free to drill deep wells and use this water to grow stuff. And so where where there is a lack of trust in an institution is very apparent there, where people who have been farming there and stand to be impacted are reluctant to work with the state to come up with a groundwater management regime that would work for them. They're reluctant to meter their wells and report their groundwater use. That may be a distrust. It may just be a fatigue with having to comply and report, but certainly it doesn't help. It is standing in the way of doing something about the vulnerability of rural communities.
And I guess I would say, stepping back into the Colorado River for a moment, I don't know to what degree political polarization has been so much of a problem. I guess it's always a problem, but compared to the ginormous problem of the over-allocation of the Colorado River, I'm not sure it rises to a level that has caused overt problems. Maybe it has, and I'm just not aware. But I will say that if you talk to most of the people who work in the space in the Colorado River and are at the table or influence the table or know those who do, there seems to be a general preference that Congress stays out of it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that really has so much to do with lack of trust as it has to do with the fact that, water users know their needs. And they tend to know their neighbors' needs, and they tend to know the needs of those who are also involved in that space better than those in Washington, people who are in Washington, D.C. And so I think there's a preference to solve problems at the lowest possible level. Isn't always possible. And what's interesting about what's been happening on the Colorado River this last year is that, for decades there was talk about, keep the federal government out of this, and we need to come up with our own solutions. But things got so bad this last year that for the first time ever, I heard people actually saying, maybe the federal government needs to come in here and start knocking some heads, because I'm not sure we can do this. So I don't know. To me, I don't know that it's so much political polarization or lack of trust as much as it is just local people know what they need and prefer to make solutions at that level.
I was really struck a year ago at how much difficulty our legislature had in the waning days of that last session and figuring out whether to create a new agency and grant them powers to acquire water rights from out of state and bring them in. In the end, as you all know, some new powers were granted to the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, and a new agency was not created. But the legislature really struggled over whether to create a new agency. And for a while, I was just getting increasingly agitated, almost to the point of anger, because it seemed to me that our legislature was sending the signal that they hate government more than they hate the problem they're trying to solve. Now, maybe we got over that. But it began to look a little bit like that for a while. And so I do think it is germane to acknowledge that even here locally among us as Arizonans, there are very different notions about what government should do and how it should perform those duties. And we have to be realistic about that too.
You can just think about the community of Rio Verde next to Scottsdale, where the government solutions on hand aren't apparently acceptable and being implemented. So people are really struggling to get their water, in part because of what you just were talking about, Richard.
I'll just add, I think there is, at least in the tribal community, some distrust that's kind of historic. I'll give you an example. In 2019 or so, the Biden-Harris administration ran a campaign on a strong tribal nations platform that they would protect and enforce treaty rights and economic development in tribal communities and so forth. And they've been great. They've done a lot of good things. But on March 20th, during our arguments, we saw the Department of Justice in their opening arguments basically say the United States has no affirmative duties to the Navajo Nation, that they don't have any obligations other than, protecting the right to use water as the Navajo Nation would do at its own discretion. And so it just kind of echoes, what tribes deal with in the political landscape that we're in. At the same time, I always am reminded of a tribal leader from Duck Valley, Shoshone, who was talking one time about the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service and all the issues that tribes have had with them historically. And he said, they're ugly babies, but they're our babies, And so this is kind of the world that we're in, and we understand that. And because of the way that tribal property rights are held, and because of the different restrictions on those tribal property rights, everything that we do requires federal action, it requires congressional action. And so it is, kind of the world and the realm that we live in. And so we bring that to the table, and I think sometimes that causes a little bit of frustration in these discussions as well. But that's just kind of the reality of the world that tribes live in.
Now, I'm going to put a plug in for the journal that we're publishing. The Ninth Circuit has a Western Legal History journal. It's going to be coming out it's going to address the intersection of law and history in the Colorado River Basin. If you just want a page turner, you read the history of the Colorado River, which is just the most bananas story with a whole bunch of crazy characters. But one thing I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts about is because I want us to at least integrate that historic component into our conversation. Can you think of a great leader in the history of the development of the law of the river who you think made a real difference? And what virtue or characteristic did they possess that allowed them to make a difference?
I don't want to go first. Okay, no one else is, so I will. I did think about this, and I couldn't come up with one, and not because there aren't people who have done amazing things on the Colorado River, because there really are. There are too many to name. But I think that the history of the Colorado River has also it's fundamentally a very human one, and for every leader that you could hold up and say, wow, look at this accomplishment, or look at this amazing thing that they did, a lot of them also did some pretty horrible things, particularly as it relates to the tribes. And so it's difficult to pick out individuals in that light for me. But I think that that's what makes it a really compelling human story, and that's why there are some truly amazing characters. I guess I would say I hope, looking forward to a future that is going to be much hotter and much drier, and that is going to be full of challenges that are even more difficult than the ones that we've been dealing with to date, that those leaders who do step up take the time to understand both the accomplishments but also the failings of those who've come before us.
Maybe while our panelists think about folks, I'll give you a fun story to tell you how crazy it is, which is when the Boulder Canyon Project Act was enacted in 1928, California began building Parker Dam, and Arizona refused to sign on to the compact and was adamantly opposed to the Boulder Canyon Project Act and had spies embedded in the construction crew in California. When California crossed the river into Arizona, those spies rode in to Phoenix to warn Governor Moores at the time that California had invaded. And he marched troops out and sailed the Navy of Arizona up the river in order to kick out the invading Californians. And Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, got wind of Arizona's plan, marched troops from Fort Huachuca to intercept them and calm everyone down. Now, the craziest part is, at the exact same time that this is happening, there was a water conflict over the Red River between Oklahoma and Texas that resulted in declaring martial law. And there's actual correspondence amongst generals in the Third Reich in Germany at the time saying that the United States will not enter into a world war because they are about to descend into a water-based civil war. Bananas!
That was the guy that made the "Don't California My Arizona" sticker. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate my colleagues' comments. I think I kind of had the same thought. I think when you think about the law of the river and you think about the overallocation problem that we're in, a lot of that started by human actions, right? And so a lot of what we're doing is cleanup, for things that, were missteps. At the same time, my grandfather actually helped build Parker Dam. So that's, maybe he'll be the guy that I say is a great guy, but yeah, it's a good question. I just had the same kind of conundrum though.
Well, I will take the liberty of talking about somebody who is indirectly associated with the law of the river. That's just a constraint that's too much. And I think a lot these days about how most elected officials don't have the bandwidth to really understand water law. They just don't. And they often don't have constituents who want them to devote the bandwidth to understanding water law because their constituents, their water keeps running every day, but they're worried about safety and education and jobs. And I have devoted a lot of thought recently to the value of technocrats, how many subjects are now really kind of handed over to technocrats, and then elected officials just have to trust them. And I think we're moving that way in many areas. Water is one of them. But there was a moment in Arizona where our governor was a water technocrat, and that was when Bruce Babbitt was governor, and he understood how important it was to do something about groundwater. He wasn't the only one, many did, but he did have I don't know if it was the boldness, the guts to create an ultimatum. I actually confirmed this with Senator Kyle last week, that Bruce Babbitt actually really did ask Secretary Andrus to threaten that the federal government wouldn't build the Central Arizona Project Canal unless Arizona enacted groundwater reform. And that ultimatum was enough to finally, it really made a difference in terms of getting people to the table to negotiate a groundwater code, for better or for worse. But I think I hope anyone who's thinking about water in Arizona can agree that the groundwater code has been critical to water certainty, water security, to the value of land in Central Arizona, and maybe even to keeping farming going within the active management areas. And it really was something, without Governor Babbitt, I don't know whether Arizona could have made that happen.
Now, we have policymakers here, leaders in water. Imagine you have a magic wand and you get one wish, one legal policy reform. What's the one that you would pick and why in order to move water management forward more sustainably, more equitably, either in Arizona or across the Colorado River Basin?
I went first last time, so I think it's on you guys.
The one thing that I would not pick is any attempt to make it easier to transfer water from where it is to where it may be desired. And my stance on that personally is all about a sense of ethics for rural Arizona. I mean, Catherine, you said it, everybody needs access to water, clean water, healthy water. And not to mention, the environment would like to have a little water too. But, you know, our history is that nobody speaks for the environment, at least not in a legal sense. Well, I think that residents of rural Arizona need to keep access to water so that they can continue to live there if that's their preference, so that succeeding generations can do the same. Not everybody can live in a city, and not everybody wants to live in a city. I recognize that free market economists frequently argue that water should flow to the highest, best use. And that's nearly always defined as, you know, domestic use. But I don't think economics is the only relevant discipline here. And I do think, since, you know, we talked about equity, and I apologize a little bit for throwing a wet blanket on the idea that it's even a useful concept, but I do think that part of what's implied when we talk about equity is that we will at least give consideration to the needs of the unborn generations. And if we're not doing that, then I don't think we're doing economic justice.
You know, Rhett, in some of your prior work, you mentioned that all over the world, water scarcity leads to migration and different communities having to move to where the water's at, and that's just kind of a component of civilization. So for me, it's more enforcing the trust and the treaty responsibility, because tribes basically ceded their right to migrate and to move to different areas in exchange for opening up the Western United States to non-natives. And so the idea that the federal government doesn't have any active fiduciary duty to protect their water resources, when basically Section 2 of the treaty, I believe, says that you're under the protection and jurisdiction of the United States forever, to me is just nonsensical. And so I would like to see, you know, some teeth, you know, put into those treaty promises for present and future generations.
Well, I do disagree with Richard somewhat, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I will mention, just for fun, that, you know, farmers are often willing sellers, because, you know, the next generation doesn't always want to farm, and because, you know, you can make a lot of money off of those transactions. And so what is interesting is that for all that, those kinds of transfers from rural and farming communities into cities are extremely controversial. And certainly there are great concerns about the environment and quality of life. It is often farmers themselves who oppose legislation that would disenable it, because they want to be able to sell someday if they so choose. But for me, the magic wand that I would wave is that I would, I'm sorry, there are many different ways to do this from a policy perspective, and I'm not going to pick just one, but I would find a way to greatly expand the use of system conservation on the Colorado River. And for those who might not know, system conservation entails paying people, tribes, farmers, cities, they've all participated. So it's been equitable in that regard, but it involves paying people to leave water in the river, not so that they can use it later in time, but basically leaving it there so that it benefits the system and props up water levels in Lakes Powell and Mead. You know, we started with system conservation about 2013-ish as a pilot program. I think it has seen some successes, but at its current scale, it's not nearly enough. And so if I could wave a magic wand, I would find a way to expand that by orders of magnitude.
These are all very important waves of the magic wand. So I'll just say that I would meter all non-exempt wells and report groundwater withdrawals throughout the state.
Well, Sarah, just that's one of my favorites, which is I feel like in policy we often jump to conservation or we jump to augmentation. I always feel like in orders of priority, I'm not sure that, understanding our water is a higher priority even than conserving our water, because at this stage, a lot of the low-hanging conservation fruit has been picked, and to know where to pick the next fruit requires understanding about where our investments are going to be. One of the things I think about is, especially on these issues of water markets, which is water markets are complex tools. But one thing I worry about, and this takes us back into the history, is if you think about anybody who's seen the movie Chinatown or read Cadillac Desert, which there's a book review from Governor Babbitt that's coming out about Cadillac Desert in this journal that's coming forth. But one of the things people talk about is, oh, these farmers that were ripped off by Los Angeles and by Mulholland and Eaton. The farmers in Owens Valley actually walked away with pretty good checks in their pockets. The people who got hurt in the Owens Valley weren't the farmers. The people who got hurt were the tractor repairmen and the fertilizer salesman and the school teacher and the dry cleaner. It was the people around the farmers who ended up really paying the price and watching their community destroyed. So I'm not sure there's a way to wave a magic wand on this, but if we are going to use markets as tools, those markets have to be sensitive to the people who aren't direct market participants, but who are impacted by the outcome of the market.
As the economist, I'll say you have to find a way to internalize the externalities so that when that transaction takes place, there is compensation for those types of effects.
Now, I want to make sure we're leaving enough time for the audience to have questions. So I think I will ask one question now that will go to everyone. We'll leave questions open after that. I always worry that when we have water conversations that we end up depressing people. I confess I am a terminal optimist. I think the future in Arizona is bright. I think our water future is bright. So I want to ask our panelists, I hope each one of you will give us what makes you excited? What's giving you hope in the water world right now?
My turn to go first.
Okay.
I mean, for me, it encompasses water, but it's something probably bigger than that. It's the younger generation. I feel like I got middle school kids, elementary school kids, and they are really clued in at an early age to all of these things that we're talking about, protecting the environment, conservation. My daughter made me buy a composter last week, putting that together. So all those things, I think they're in the right space. I think they understand, the world that we've given them, for better or for worse, and they understand that in order to get through, to future generations, that they're kind of taking the baton to make the different changes. So for me, I'm really hopeful about the direction that I see in a lot of the youth out there. And I think it's up to us to try to help provide them with tools that they need to help do the next job, I think.
I've been really impressed with how much work has gone into trying to manage the crisis. About a year ago, when some of us really began to focus on the condition of the reservoirs, there were a lot of people saying, we're not managing the crisis at all. We're just engaged in scare tactics. But in the last 6 months, I've been seeing a lot of activity. It's not all public. In the water world, a lot goes on all the time that just is not obvious until later. There are kind of secret or confidential negotiations going on all the time. But I'm seeing a lot of activity, and I think that's a positive sign. People have been energized. People came to understand we can't just sit here, and we can't be satisfied with a conclusion that we don't know what to do. That just is not acceptable. And I'm seeing activity which heartens me a lot.
So I'm going to say the thing that makes me both optimistic and pessimistic. Humans have been moving water for thousands of years, and it turns out we're really good at it. And what that means is that the problems before us are technologically solvable, probably affordable if prioritized and spread over a large enough population to effectuate them. But what that means, and so that's what makes me very optimistic. These problems are solvable, and it turns out that humans are actually pretty good at solving water problems. What makes me pessimistic is that means because they are feasible technologically and financially, oftentimes the reason why we haven't solved them is because of the politics. And I'm super pessimistic on the politics. But I remain optimistic that we can find ways to overcome that and solve these problems.
I'm not sure you were supposed to go to what makes you pessimistic.
Oh, sorry.
But I do agree that the water issues, all of our water issues in Arizona and in the Colorado Basin really have a huge political component. And I will say that what gives me hope is what Derrick said. In the long run, there may be improvement in our political approach. It seems hard to imagine that right now, but I have the same thing. I have 3 adult children. They're much better people than I am. And maybe we can hope that that the future generations won't put up with so much political shenanigans as we're currently putting up with. I have to say the other thing is, my soundbite, and that is every big city in the United States is confronting climate change impacts. And, in Louisiana, they might just be washed away by a big hurricane. Houston, same thing. Boston is trying to build a seawall because rising ocean levels are threatening Boston. And what's the challenge for Phoenix? Get more water. Phoenix can easily deal with that challenge compared with the challenges that other major cities are dealing with as a result of climate change impacts. So I'm not very worried. I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic, but a hotter, drier future for cities doesn't scare me much.
So I will give you my reasons for optimism. Some of those reasons are sitting in this audience right now. So when I started out as a teacher, I used to think that my favorite thing about being a teacher was being in the classroom and teaching. And it is not. It's my second favorite thing. My new favorite thing is when I go to meetings or when I'm involved in proceedings and I see my students be exceptional water leaders and exceptional water attorneys. And the longer I do this job, the more often it happens. And we have an amazing group of water leaders coming up in this state who are going to give us a really bright future. The other things that make me optimistic are, and this goes back to, this is a Western legal history journal, which is the history of our people, the history of our species, is the history of desert rivers. We learned how to live together beyond families and tribes on the banks of desert rivers. Desert rivers are the great incubators of human ingenuity and of human cooperation. The Indus, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile, this is where we learned how to be neighbors. Which is why I think that great desert rivers, like the river basin we live in right now, remains a great incubator of cooperation. And I think we're going to come together over it. I think it's going to be a catalyst for unity and not for division. And the last thing I'll say about the history of Arizona is that our history has been one, and we're in a court of law right now, so I want to take it back to law. Our history has been one where legal challenges have forced us to innovate. So when the Kent Decree was coming out and we were struggling to share water in the Salt River Valley, new innovations created the Salt River Project. When we were struggling to negotiate and litigating with each other, we reached, and we finally got to Arizona v. California. What came out of Arizona v. California was the Central Arizona Project. When we were struggling to get along with each other and pecan farmers were suing cities and mines, legal challenge forced us to innovate and we got the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. Our history is one where the law has been the sort of pull to lead us into a brighter future. And I still think that that's going to come. Arizona has a history that every 30 or 40 years, we do something great to remind the world that we are one of the greatest water-thinking jurisdictions ever.
and we can do it again. We just are past due. We're about 10 years behind, and we have to do honor to those who came before us by doing something great one more time.
Cool.
All right, so I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience.
So the question is, why not use eminent domain to condemn water rights and use that as the means through which we achieve water conservation?
So I'll start, and I'm sure others will add. In Colorado, there is actually a constitutional preference for municipal use, and my limited understanding of their laws is that they can, in fact, use eminent domain to acquire agricultural water rights. But you know, it may be possible, but here in Central Arizona, we've been fortunate that our municipal growth has occurred on agricultural lands. So that process sort of happened naturally through you know, supply and demand in the market for housing and subdivisions. So we've been really lucky to actually grow onto those agricultural lands rather than need to acquire them elsewhere. But we've kind of reached the limit of that. And I think that's why you're seeing entities like Queen Creek and others start to look to agricultural transfers off the river, because we've already pretty much grown on nearly all of the agricultural lands here in Central Arizona.
Perhaps another way of addressing that question is to acknowledge something that Professor Larson talks about a lot. One of the problems with conservation is if you don't use your water right, somebody else will. And whether you reduce somebody's consumption by eminent domain or by application of technology or in some other way, you have to think through the whole process of what's going to happen to the water molecules that stayed in the system because you exercise forbearance on using the water you used to use.
Mm-hmm. I think eminent domain to solve the Colorado River shortage would be like, let's send in the jackbooted, you know, thugs to, I mean, it would be very heavy-handed and incredibly threatening to impacted communities, and it would be vigorously contested every which way. But it's a good question. You know, one of the reasons why there's resistance in Rio Verde, a community about which I know way too much, to forming the entity that is available to them under Arizona law that would solve their problems. And hopefully you all know about Rio Verde, the community by Scottsdale that's been hauling water from the city of Scottsdale, and Scottsdale is now in phase 1 of its drought plan and said we can no longer allow people to haul our precious water to their wildcat community. But under Arizona law, in our statutes, is a government entity, a sub-authority of the state of Arizona called a domestic water improvement district, and people in Rio Verde could form a DWID, and then they would have the legal authority to basically acquire water supplies and get someone to treat it and continue to haul it. But people are terrified that the DWID will take their wells by eminent domain. This is something that comes up all the time in Rio Verde. Well owners are very resistant to the formation of a DWID because they're afraid that eminent domain will come in and take their well. Very unlikely, because it would be so much cheaper just to buy water and continue to haul it. But I like the question because it gets us to the kinds of voluntary agreements that are available to help solve some of the water problems that are arising as a result of shortage. And an example of that is in California, a large irrigation district, the Palo Verde Irrigation District, is in a voluntary agreement with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California to do rotational fallowing or other types of water conservation programs paid for by ratepayers in cities in Southern California. You know, you get the farmers to leave water in the system, and the people who pay for it and benefit from it are cities in Southern California. There is probably room for deals like that, and there are examples of this in other places, but that's a big one. There is probably room for deals like that in Arizona. We haven't got to the place where there's a lot of comfort talking about deals like that. But, you know, you don't have to have eminent domain. You just need money. And you probably can solve a lot of the water problems, the water challenges.
Yeah, that reminds me, I meant to offer up just a quick note when we were talking about legal reforms that might make a difference. I think we should also look at financial reforms.
So there is
Can I just ask, do you mean like tax preferences for agricultural production
Oh, sure.
on
Of course.
non-renewing groundwater?
I'm just really echoing your point about money makes such a difference. Yeah.
And cities have money. You know, that's what I think about all the time. Cities have a lot of money, and it, you know, that can be activated.
So the question is, how do California water rights play a role in Colorado River relations and litigation?
Well, so Colorado's water rights are for the most part.
California.
Sorry, California. I have Colorado on the mind. California's water rights are for the most part senior to the water rights that we have here in central Arizona, though there's more parity between California's water rights and the water rights on the Colorado River in western Arizona, particularly those held by the Colorado River Indian tribes and then the irrigation districts and water users associations in Yuma. So, but to more succinctly answer that question, you know, they tend to be senior water rights to those of us here in central Arizona. And so as such, when shortage comes, central Arizona takes cuts before California does.
And this is one of the things that makes equity such a complex thing to talk about in water is one of the most powerful entities in the Colorado River Basin, maybe an entity you don't know about, which is called the Imperial Irrigation District. The Imperial Irrigation District has very high priority water rights to 3.1 million acre feet. And you think, well, they're very privileged. They sit at the front of the line. They're very powerful. But that community also faces real challenges. The drying up of the Salton Sea has resulted in real health issues. And so talking about equity is the law of the river, are our institutions over-privileging the Imperial Irrigation District, or is the Imperial Irrigation District actually in some ways left behind? And I think there are people in that community who would say, we get that we're at the front of the line in water law, but that doesn't mean that everything in our community is great, which is why equity's such a tough thing to talk about in a nuanced way in water.
Yeah, and you know, something like, 90% of children have asthma thanks to the Salton Sea in those counties, in Imperial County. That there's another consideration that I think I could shove into the equity basket, and that is that it was our national policy through the end of the 19th century and much of the 20th century to try to put every acre of land we could under the plow, to use federal financing to do these big disruptive projects to move water so that there could be farming all over the West. And I think it's important to remember that context and understand that the situation we have here now is the product of a very deliberate federal policy. And it's going to take that kind of deliberate, broad group of stakeholders from the federal government down to the municipal water provider or the tribal water manager to transform the American West. It's not good guys and bad guys. It's really embracing, this is how we got here historically, and we know that it isn't tenable.
So the question is, how do you see the outcome being of the federal government getting involved in the 7-state negotiations, and what leverage or reason might exist for California to enter into negotiations and give up some of that senior priority?
I just have to say we have an office pool on that very question. If you want to join, just let me know.
I'll answer the second part, but then I'm going to leave it to someone else to say what they think is going to happen. One of the reasons that California may be willing to come to the table is that California would very much like to continue and potentially expand its use of Lake Mead as a reservoir in which it can store water and then use it later. And up until 2007, that was not possible. You could not, you either had to use your water or lose it. And then in later years, we created something called intentionally created storage, which allows certain entities to undertake extraordinary conservation measures. That's a whole subjective thing, but undertake extraordinary conservation measures and then leave that water in Lake Mead and be able to take it out at a later point in time. So basically, you get to put your name on water in Lake Mead. That type of storage is very valuable to California in years when their state water project does not have a lot of water available through it. And the cities of Southern California very much depend on both Colorado River water and the water delivered through the state water project. So that's something California wants, right? Is to be able to expand their use of that type of storage in Lake Mead. So that's why they might come to the table. I'm gonna leave it to someone else to say what they think will happen.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of commentators predict that the Secretary will not impose cuts according to strict priority. Relying on some language in Arizona v. California, the idea is that there will be proportionate cuts, but not strictly in accordance with priority. Now that really is probably a little bit upsetting to a lot of lawyers because, you know, we tend to think in terms of what our entitlements are by contract or otherwise. And I don't like it when somebody else has an idea that may disregard our rights. But then I'm reminded of a little comedic sketch that George Carlin likes to use, which I frankly don't think is very funny, but I'll share it because it makes a point. He said, everybody's talking about their rights all the time, this right, that right. He says, I've got news for your people. Nobody has any rights. We made them up. Well, okay, but that opens the door to deviate from pretty well-established law.
Well, please join me in thanking my friends and our panelists and for all of your participation.
And on behalf of the NJCHS, I would like to thank you again all for being here and thank our amazing panel. I could have sat here and listened to them for hours, and I'm very hopeful that we will get a chance to hear from them more again. Thank you all for being here. Please do check out our website, njchs.org. Get on our mailing list so you can see more programs like this. And we will have a link to the recording of this program, so if you have friends who've missed it and you know would enjoy it, as we all would, you will be able to find that link on our website. So thank you again for being here, and thanks again once for our panel.